Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. We're so glad to be with you on this breezy Friday afternoon. There have been so many vitally important news events that have happened over the last 2 weeks. We didn't record last week because both Scott and Bailey were in transit, and I was involved in another call, a different podcast. And so we're here this week, and we're going to attempt to do a wrap up of everything that's happened over the last 2 weeks, or at least a bunch of things. I think this will be a lightning round of an episode so that we don't get too worked up about any one thing, because honestly we could spend an hour about every one of these items, and we have 9 items on our agenda as it is. That's an entire workday worth of podcasting. So we'll get into it on these things, and I'm going to try to go least to most emotional, I'll say it that way, at least for me. So joining me today, of course, are my two wonderful co-hosts, Bailey Perkins Wright. Hello.
Hello.
And Dr. Scott Melson. Hello, sir.
Y'all, this wind is nonsense.
It is. I think it's supposed to die down tonight because tomorrow there's almost no wind. It's like a 3 mile an hour. Very lovely. Should be a nice weekend.
Can we just start there and say the wind is nonsense? I'm over it. It needs to stop. It also needs to be colder, and that is all. And now we can move on to the next real topic.
You'll get both of those things in short order. I need the wind to die down so I can go reclaim all of my Halloween decor that is blown down the street, I think, at this point. Well, I'm going to go in order on what we have on our sheet here, you guys. I'm going to start with the changes to the legislative leadership, because this feels somewhat benign. So as we prepare for, I guess for special session, will these changes be in place for special session, or do they kick in next year in the spring?
That is a good question. My assumption would be that these are going to take place in the spring, because I think that they're going to want to get in and out with special session as fast as they can. And there's obviously the short story here, right? So we've got Senator McCourtney. It'll be taken over as Senate Majority Floor Leader from Senator Kim David. That's probably the biggest one, right?
Yeah, and Kim David is running for the Corporation Commission,
right?
Which is one of the most important state agencies you've never heard of. They oversee the energy companies.
And Senator McCourtney is an experienced senator. He's a super sharp guy. But there is like a flow to these things and rules and procedure. And I don't know if special session, if they're going to want to, if that's the time for him to kind of get his feet wet or not.
Well, and it may not really matter either, right? Because it's not like they're having a bunch of committee meetings during special session. They're just really like one committee and then floor, and then they're out. So, so they're switching up. Julie Daniels is no longer she's no longer chair of the judiciary. That's a big change. And
she's now the
she's still vice chair.
Well, she's co-chair of the newly created Joint Committee on Administrative Rules.
That's interesting, because that pertains to state agencies and like what rules they pass, right? And the legislature has to formally approve them. Interesting. Well, we'll see. That is a big change. I will say, on behalf of the podcast, congratulations to Senator McCourtney for becoming the floor leader. That's a big day. He's a friend of the pod.
Friend of the show. Been on several times.
Yeah.
And then also Senator Paxton and Senator Lee Wright have been promoted to assistant majority floor leaders. So
I feel like, and maybe this is just me talking, but I feel like these changes made sense. Like there wasn't anything that was like totally unexpected. I guess we kind of thought Senator David might remain as floor leader for one more term, but also we recognize that Senator Treat, the pro tem, will be terming out, I think, after his current term, right? So I think there's the initial kind of jockeying for position for what that looks like, and so we'll see. I think it'll. Well, I don't know. Who knows? I'm not going to cast any lots on what I think the session's going to go like next year. It's an election year. It could go lots of directions.
It's an election year, which means there's going to be a lot of nonsense, right? Like an election year means there's going to be a lot of bullshit. That's what that means.
Well, and that's what we've learned, especially over the past few years, is that things ebb and flow. So the things that we predict sometimes go in a different direction. So it'll be interesting to see how things shake out, especially over the next year.
Well, then let's go to our next item, and that is there were several abortion laws passed in the spring, 3, I think, and I think they've all now been blocked or otherwise put on hold by the courts pending lawsuits. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, at least all in to some degree. Yes, they've all been intervened upon by the courts.
We've seen additional lawsuits in Texas regarding their abortion laws and the how that is playing out. And so, as of right now, the law in Oklahoma governing abortion is no different than it was 6 months ago, right? Like it's
Yeah, and this just, this just goes this is more evidence of the fact that despite what leadership at the state legislature thinks, this shows that the House of Representatives and the state Senate in Oklahoma do not in fact have the power to overrule the United States Supreme Court, or determine what laws are and are not constitutional. They can bray about what is and isn't constitutional all they want to, but they don't get to decide that. The courts do, and the courts have spoken for the time being. Obviously, all of this could change in the near future, with some cases that are currently pending before the Supreme Court of the United States. But until those shake out, it seems like the state and federal courts are respecting precedent and saying nope, these weren't constitutional a year ago, they weren't constitutional 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago when you passed similar versions of them, and they're still not constitutional now.
And one thing I hope that the taxpayers will pay attention to is that we can't make policy off of principles and worldviews, right? Because if we're not crafting policy through the lens of constitutionality, then we're running into situations where we're spending our finite resources on stopping things and wasting time, right? That weren't going to go through in the first place. And so there's probably going to be many more moments until the legislature really is strategic on how it approaches policy. And I know I don't foresee that being the case, especially as we enter into an election season. And so, but that's just something that taxpayers have to pay attention to.
yeah, that's exactly right.
Andy, there's one thing I wanted to mention in our conversation about leadership changes in the Capitol that I will be interested in following. We know that former Majority Leader Kim David, or Majority Floor Leader Kim David, was very strongly in support of managed care when it comes to how we're going to structure our Medicaid program. And there were many legislators in the House and Senate, particularly now Majority Leader McCourtney, who had concerns about the structure of that and the impact that would have, especially on rural areas, right? And there was some controversy around even some statements made last session. So Andy brought up a great point about Senator David being censured because of comments made about Senator McCourtney. And so it'll be interesting to see now with Senator McCourtney in this role of powerful leadership and what happens in the Medicaid managed care conversations.
Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about that. Interesting. All right, so moving on with our lightning round of news stories and difficult things happening in Oklahoma. House Bill 1674, which listeners may remember, that is the anti-protest bill we discussed quite a bit back in the spring. That does a few things, right? It penalizes people who and under the law's definition were inciting a riot or collaborating, what's conspiring with people to do this, that it set them up for like a $10,000 fine or something.
So yeah, this is the one that they can be charged with like racketeering and conspiracy, right?
Yeah, right. And then also the way it's mostly known is it's the bill that allowed provided protections for people who would drive into a crowd. So basically, like the way I think we talked about in the spring, and this is probably how it's most broadly known, is if you block a roadway, that even if you're sitting in a road, blocking the road as part of a nonviolent protest, that could be, in theory, construed as inciting a riot. And if someone drove their car into you to escape that riot because they feared for their life, then they would be free and clear. That'd be a defensible act. Now, there's lots of nuances to that, but regardless, a judge has blocked two of the three provisions of the law. That actual driving and crashing into protesters was not part of it that got blocked, but the rest of it did. And really, so you would not be charged with racketeering. You would not be fined for conspiracy, because it was a very loose connection. Like basically, if you had like ever donated to an organization and the organization was somehow affiliated with this, or you spoke to them or whatever, anyone would be subject to being charged here. And I think they blocked it on grounds of the First Amendment. So that, I believe, is a win for the First Amendment.
Well, and Andy, I'll lift as well that I'm grateful to see the legislation move in that direction because of what's happening in Kenosha right now.
Mm,
Right now, if you all remember, I think his name is Kyle Reddinghouse, was at a Black Lives Matter protest in that community, and he had a gun. And he got into conflict with a few of the protesters and shot them. And the judge right now that's currently presiding over that case is not allowing the, I don't know if this is the defense, but whoever's representing those who were shot, who were protesting, he won't allow them to be referred to as victims. He's requiring them to be referred to as rioters, as protesters, and other loaded words that almost put them at fault for what happened to them and getting shot in that instance, and almost making the person who shot the protesters come across as a victim, right? And so we see many of these biases within our criminal justice system and the interpretations of judges. And so my fear is definitely that something similar can happen in Oklahoma, especially if a law like HB 1674 is put in place.
yeah, yeah, that's right. On a related note, the ACLU of Oklahoma and the NAACP of Oklahoma have filed a lawsuit to block House Bill 1775. That's the critical race theory bill. Um, there was an effort to repeal that law that did not successfully collect enough signatures to do that. And so this lawsuit was filed, I guess,
And
last
Andy,
week.
I wouldn't even call this the critical race theory bill, right? Because the legislation itself bans conversations related to race and gender, and it prohibits colleges and universities, public colleges, universities, particularly, from being able to require diversity trainings and other coursework related to that. And so the way that the bill is written, and one of the plaintiffs even is a teacher at a public school who said that his district told him, or at least his institution, his school told him that he wasn't allowed to use words like diversity or white privilege and other terminologies related to talking about race and gender. And so that is a piece of this lawsuit, is talking about how this is censorship, right? And how it's intentionally targeting conversations related to certain groups of people.
That's right. And, any kind of government act that is designed to cool the freedom of speech, I think that's usually the term that's made, right? Um, that would dissuade someone from fully exercising their First Amendment rights is unconstitutional. And listeners, I'll give a plug here for one of my other hats I wear at Freedom of Information Oklahoma. Next Tuesday, November 2nd, we are hosting our annual First Amendment Congress that morning. It'll be a virtual event, of course, streamed on our YouTube. And one of two of the panels will be about this very lawsuit and about this very issue. In fact, we'll have Melvin Hall, who is the attorney represents the NAACP of Oklahoma, as one of our panelists. We'll also have Abby Henderson and Ellie, whose last name escapes me, that we had on the podcast back in the spring talking about these laws. They will also be panelists there. You can learn more about the First Amendment Congress at foioklahoma.org. You can sign up and you'll get the link there. It should be good. It should be a very interesting discussion to talk about these laws in Oklahoma and also how these are not isolated. This is part of a concerted, um, organized effort across the country to, and honestly, to infringe on Americans' First Amendment rights, right?
And especially the purpose of college particularly is to A, help college grads be global citizens, right? Have those critical thinking skills to be able to process many different ideas and to be able to um, draw conclusions based off of the information that they're able to digest, right?
Yeah.
And if a law is preventing institutions from being able to teach on certain subjects, that doesn't create um, a plate of like robust discussions and perspectives and exposure to different ideas. I believe it was OCCC even canceled a class, I think it was a summer ago, related to um, race and other things or diversity because of the way that this law was written. And
Yeah.
so it could have some rippling effects, especially if how broad and complicated the language is, to where it could be interpreted all kinds of ways depending on how different institutions want to interpret it. So, Andy, I am glad that you all are having that discussion related to the various laws that try to suppress speech and the free exchange of ideas.
Yeah. This reminds me, Bailey, of when I was a freshman in college many moons ago. I entered college as a theology religion major with the plan to become a minister. Right, I went to Southern Nazarene here in Bethany, and about halfway through my freshman year, a lot of my fellow religion majors were, pardon the joke, but losing their religion and really questioning things. And I was talking to one of my professors, and he said they had gotten some complaints from parents, like after Christmas break, students go home, spend time with the family. The parents are like, "Oh my gosh, what are you teaching them?" SNU, not known as a bastion of liberalness, right? And these professors told the parents, and it was mostly religion and philosophy, right? It was all that department. They said, "Our job is to teach your children how to think." Right? Philosophy is really the science of thinking in some ways, and we teach them how to think. They come to college with their preconceived um, understanding of religion, of their faith, of where it exists in the world and what it means for them. Our job is to carefully take it apart so that they and then help them rebuild it based on history, on tradition, and on their own experience, right? And on the readings and the lessons of theologians throughout history. And we look back at uh, famous, well-known theologians throughout history. We know their names because they questioned one another. It wasn't because they took the lessons of one and just everyone went with that, right? Like this is, and so to the extent that we do that with religion itself, we should also do it with history. We should be open to questions, to analysis, to wrestling with what these things mean for us as individuals, for us as a society, because the end result is a much more, I think, robust and stronger society and a stronger sense of self for us as individuals. And
It
so, go ahead, Scott.
No, yeah, I mean, 100%. It's a stronger society, but I think what's unspoken there is it's a stronger society because it might reframe ideas about who we are and where we come from and how our society is structured. And in that reframing, there are those among us that might lose power and privilege, and it might be granted to other people who haven't had it before. And so,
And Scott, it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it'll be uncomfortable to say that thing my grandma taught me wasn't exactly the full story. It wasn't the full picture, right? Or that thing that I learned in this way, may have other lenses to it. Like that's hard to digest for a lot of people.
yeah. So it's like so many things. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this the last couple of weeks for a bunch of reasons, but man, so much of our politics and our civil discourse, not just around politics right now, and this has probably always been true, and it's just about different things, but so much of it boils down to fear, right? Like fear is such a powerful emotion. um and it's disheartening to see lesser leaders, and politicians in particular, use fear, right? But they do it, I think, because it's easy, right? Like it's easy to win an election by making people afraid, or it's easier, right? It's really hard to win an election by telling people that they don't need to be afraid. um it's really hard to change policy by telling people they don't need to be afraid.
Well, and sometimes when it's something we've never experienced before and it's something that's different than the status quo, it seems like the sky is falling until it's not, right? I am a part of Leadership Oklahoma's Class 34, and we're into the heart of our experience. And the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice, OCCJ, did a implicit bias training. OCCJ did a implicit bias training that I thought was really powerful because they had this slide that showed whenever landmark cases were decided by the Supreme Court and what public opinion of it was at the time that it was decided, and then where public opinion stands today. So they gave the examples about same-sex marriage, right? They gave the examples about integration. They gave so other landmark moments that people were fearful of. People were afraid that if black and white people use the same water fountain, or if that people end up marrying the same gender, then our whole values and our whole world is going to fall apart. And so you had those approval ratings of like, within the teens or in like, maybe 20% max of people supporting it. And then you look at it today to where we're look back at that time of like, why was that even an issue, right? And so there's so many things that it just takes taking people along kicking and screaming, because over time it's going to be okay. And then our children and then our grandchildren are going to have an entire new world to where they won't even be able to compute why something was even an issue. I love talking to my stepdaughter who's 7 about the idea that she couldn't go to school, if she lived, 50, 60 years ago when her granny was in school, that she wouldn't be able to go to school with white children. And that doesn't make sense to her, right? But there was a time where white children in 50, 60 years ago felt afraid. So sometimes we just got to take people along with that fear, just kicking and screaming, to know eventually it's going to be okay.
Amen to that, sis.
That's exactly right. Well, let's move on to our next item, and that is that there was an attempt to. Well, I think there's a discussion about whether or not voters could recall Oklahoma County District Attorney David Prater the law does not allow for recall of district attorneys, which is perhaps a flaw in the law.
Can any elected official in Oklahoma be recalled?
Maybe.
I didn't think we could.
I will text someone who knows more than we do in just a moment and find out. But I can say that
It hasn't happened, at least. There's not a precedence of that.
Yeah. I mean, they tried to recall the mayor and some city council members in Norman, right? So that happened. They didn't. I mean, they tried. They didn't do it successfully. Regardless, when it comes to the DA here in Oklahoma County, there is now an effort to collect signatures on a petition, and that petition would not recall him directly, but it would impanel a grand jury to investigate him, which I think is a wonderfully creative way to get to the same result, right? Like the goal, I think, of folks is to investigate his conduct, his actions, his conflicts, um, and his abuse of power as a district attorney. And so this is a good way to do it. And so they are currently collecting signatures. They don't need that many.
About 5,000.
That's not. That's. I mean, as someone who tried to do a ballot initiative where I needed 250,000, this seems much more attainable.
So usually the DA in a particular county like is in charge of the grand jury, right? So if citizens vote to create a grand jury to investigate the DA, who runs the grand jury?
That's a really good question.
Right? Because usually, like the Oklahoma County grand jury is like the DA is like the head of it, and the AG is the head, I think, of the multi-county grand jury, right? So if you got a grand jury to investigate the DA, who is in charge of it? Is it one of his subordinates? Because that would also be a conflict of interest. Is it somebody from the AG's office? Is it an outside attorney? Who is empowered to like call like because I mean I know again this is coming from John Grisham novels, not like not my not the law school that I haven't gone to, but like my understanding is that like there's a grand jury and like the DA's office decides like what witnesses are like not doesn't decide. I think the grand jury can like call witnesses.
Yeah.
But I think it's heavily run by the DA. Like the DA suggests like maybe we should call this witness, maybe we should call that witness. Here's some evidence that you could consider. Here's some evidence that you could. Who does that if there's a grand jury investigating the DA?
Mm-hmm.
You raise a really important question of because I mean all of this is unprecedented, right? And so it'll be interesting to see what the process looks should this go into play.
I texted a local attorney who is knowledgeable on these things, and they said that someone will be appointed by the judge, I assume. And then as far as recalls go,
the judge who is like buddies with the DA.
Well, that's always a potential conflict, right? This is the thing with politics: is that it's a good old boy system,
and it's very interconnected. I think that's another challenge is that we're learning about the way our systems are designed. There are a lot of intersections in relationships.
That's right. Relationships matter, as it turns out. All right. Speaking of relationships, Tulsa Mayor G.T. Bynum is souring his relationship with the tribes. So he signed basically an amicus brief aligning with Governor Stitt that calls McGirt a huge issue, right? I mean, the governor says the McGirt ruling is the most important issue, most pressing issue facing Oklahoma ever. And I would say polling does not indicate that Oklahomans agree with him. I think less than a fourth of Oklahomans felt like it was actually that big of a deal. So Stitt's comments did not go over well, as you can imagine, with the tribes. So Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. Spoke at a rally about this just before the meeting and had some very strong words for Mayor Bynum. Chief Hoskin said, "I do not understand why he decided to resolve those challenges by throwing in with the most anti-tribal governor in the history of our state," which is saying something because we've had some pretty anti-tribal governors.
I mean, right, we had Alfalfa Bill Murray, right?
So Hoskin goes on to say, "I have no idea why any leader in this state would would throw in with Kevin Stitt when it comes to Indian affairs, because Kevin Stitt is a failure on Indian affairs. He has diminished tribal relations in this state more than any governor in its history. Those are them's fighting words.
Well, and especially because Governor Stitt has tribal citizenship, right?
I think that is somewhat contested. I mean, he's on the rolls.
He's on the rolls. So I think even to say that he's the most, anti-sovereignty, anti-tribal nations governor is a very, very strong sentiment, right? So, I mean, because we've talked about it on this podcast before, there's been several situations where Governor Stitt has become crosshaired with tribal nations. I mean, from the gaming compact and now with the McGirt case and other things. And so, one of the interesting things I think, Andy, is with Mayor Bynum signing on, the Tulsa County commissioners are like, we had no idea. And they even sent in a letter saying, we need you to remove your name and remove the city of Tulsa from this letter, because no other leaders had any idea that he was going to sign off on behalf of the city of Tulsa. So that's another interesting realm is there are other government leaders within Tulsa, like for example, Representative Monroe Nichols released a press release statement about his disappointment of Mayor Bynum signing on and hoping that he would focus on other areas. Essentially, that's the nature of the press release. But yeah, and where he stands with the tribal nations. But
All right. Well, let's keep going on another issue. Maybe this one isn't quite as much of a hot button issue. I know I said I'd sorted these by emotionality. Maybe this
no,
is a
this one definitely is because of the root of
that's true.
likely of why. So allegedly, it's not the reason, but anyways.
Right. Well, we can talk about that. And in fact, well, let me say what it is, and then we'll discuss it. So the next item on our list is a huge change in the leadership of the state Department of Health. Again, right? Commissioner Fry resigned, as did the COO, the CFO, the legislative affairs person, several others, all in a matter of days. Um, Commissioner Fry resigned the day after there was a settlement reached about in a suit pertaining to birth certificates and the inclusion of a non-binary option, right? So male, female, non-binary on there.
And other health records to allow people to identify as non-binary.
Right, right. Which I just going to say, to be clear, binary gender is a social construct and does not accurately reflect the continuum, the myriad of identities that exist. And this is one of those very tiny things where if it doesn't pertain to you, then it literally does not affect you. But for the millions of people that it does affect, it's important, right? So
Well, Andy, and I think it is important because we're talking about the agency that collects information about how different health disparities impact different communities,
yeah, yeah,
right? This is the agency that's responsible of knowing what's going on for our literal health, right? And public health. And that information is important because at the end of the day, non-binary Oklahomans exist here. And it's important to make sure, regardless of whether you believe it or not, they exist here, right? And it's important that they have the ability to be accurately identified. And so we know what's going on in communities and how to best serve them to make sure that we can be the healthiest state as possible. And so for outrage to grow on not accurately tracking health data, right, is to me outrageous.
yeah. That's exactly right. Accurate data collection is super important, and so accurate classification that reflects the public as accurately as you can is super important. Um, I when I wrote this on our list, I was thinking about the change up in leadership and not about the underlying issue because there's been so much I probably blocked it out. But yeah, the governor's comments were abhorrent, was terrible. Um,
As if there's something that he and the AG could do, right?
right.
Especially when the court said, Oklahoma State Department of Health, you will have to do this, right?
Well, and the thing is, this was a settlement that was reached, right, with the State Department of Health, and this person who used to live in Oklahoma, who lives somewhere else now, but they were born in Oklahoma. But I don't know if it was like mediated by the AG's office, but it was agreed to by the AG's office. Like this happened before AG Hunter left office, so it's not like the AG's office wasn't on board, right? It's just and it's of I mean, it's of all the things to get like worked up about of everything, right? Everything that's facing the state and the country, like that's what you're going to lose your mind over. But I mean, let's be honest, who's surprised, right? It's a culture war issue, which is where the governor is going to make his bread and butter when he tries to run for president, right? So like, or senator or whatever the hell he wants to do, right? Like that's
Well, and Scott, I think it connects to our conversation earlier about fear, right? For some reason, there's this fear that if we normalize the LGBTQ plus experience, then somehow it changes who we are as individuals, right? Like it suddenly just changes um, our world in this negative way. When the reality is that it just makes our world better and it ensures that people can be their whole selves and have the ability to benefit from every part of the American experience, right? In the same ways that everybody else is able to. And so this is going to be another one of those moments of that chart that I mentioned of, you know, people feeling one way today and it having such, you know, high strung viewpoints to where 20, 30 years from now, our kids and our grandkids are going to be wondering, why was this even an issue in the first place?
and it literally doesn't affect anybody else. What is on your birth certificate or my birth certificate or anybody, like it doesn't affect anyone else, right? Like it matters to that person, but like, and it matters for like state and like society, like as you mentioned, like collecting accurate data. But like no person's life other than the person whose birth certificate it is will be affected in any way at all by this.
I mean, it's the same thing for other issues, right? Like Black people drinking water from a water fountain didn't affect white people, except they may have had to just wait in line to
Right.
have a drink of water. You get what I'm saying? And so
Yeah.
it's a lot of these issues that are rooted in irrationality, racism, homophobia, right? And we have to call it out. We have to call it what it is.
Hmm. I mean, same thing with marriage equality, right? Someone else getting married doesn't affect my marriage. If it does, if someone else's marriage affects your marriage, you
Your
should be
marriage
worried.
got problems, right?
Yeah, right.
But I will say, in the collective sense, it affects all of us because it means that all of us aren't able to have the same rights and freedoms and abilities in this country, right? And so, like, how do I want to phrase this? Like, none of us are free until all of us are free, right? I think that's the kind of perspective that I come with it because
And I don't want to minimize that at all, Bailey. I'm just making the point that like if you had your gender identity on your birth certificate changed like tomorrow, like because that's what was best for you and that's like who you are, that will not affect my life in any way, right? Like that's like yes, like societally, like 100%. I don't, when I say that like it doesn't affect anybody else, I don't mean to like minimize the like real systemic issues there are, and to what your point is that like yes, nobody like Nobody is free until everybody is free to live their life. I just, I continue to be amazed at people like the governor and their outrage over something that literally will not impact his life at all.
It's just another form of suppression. But again, he's just going to be on the wrong side of this issue. And that's how he's going to be remembered, especially because progress is going to continue moving forward. Again, if it's kicking and screaming, dragging people along, progress is going to continue moving.
On the subject of the change up in leadership at the health department, Bailey, you're exactly right. Again, I know well, even before you joined us, Bailey, Scott and I remember recording an episode in Upper Room Studios at Scott's house where we had typed out a timeline of events with money being moved around and shenanigans at the health department. Gosh, that was in the early days. That was 4 years ago, and they've had a bumpy ride. I bet they've had at least 3 or 4 commissioners in as many years. And I have a lot of friends who work there, and that level of change of administration is difficult because it trickles down to how the agency operates, right?
Especially since we're still in a pandemic, right? And
Right.
that's an important agency related to how we respond in times of public health crises and emergencies. And so,
Well, and they're like moving locations and there's all this change. Like there's just so much going on and you need some consistency to ensure that services are being provided and that people feel secure in their work. This is the kind of thing that erodes trust and in people's employment, and they start looking for other options, right? And so you've got, I mean, there's already potential changes with the medical marijuana administration and what all that looks like, and so this is it just sucks. It sucks for
who
the employees
fall
there.
underneath the Oklahoma State Department of Health, right?
Yeah, currently, right, currently. We'll see if that remains. I know there's a couple of initiative petitions to change that, so we'll see what happens. All right, well, then let's turn to, I think, our last couple oh, excuse me. Well, then let's turn to our last couple of items for this week, and it probably works out that we don't have a ton of time because, I think we could easily all 3 rant angrily, with a lot of hurt in this as well. But as I'm sure listeners well know, yesterday the state of Oklahoma executed a man, John Grant, first person to be executed in 6 years, 7 years.
7. And since the last 2 botched
Yeah.
executions that happened where 2 men suffered,
Hmm.
right,
Yeah.
as they were being executed.
Yeah. And I was going to say the first execution in 7 years and the third botched in a row.
And in fact, there was supposed to be a stay because Oklahoma ran out of the chemicals that were used in previous executions. And that was part of the reason why the 2 executions 7 years ago happened the way that they did, was because they were experimenting with alternative chemicals. And so there was supposed to be a stay until that could be figured out, because first of all, I believe that the practice of the death penalty is inherently biased. It's a racist institution that we've maintained over time. And when we're looking at our peers in other parts of the world that sometimes we admire to be like, it's not the norm across the entire world, right? And so I'm frustrated that this man, so the thing that's, and we talked about this before the pod began, right? That there were media, so thank God for the free press, that were there watching what was happening, and they reported to us what happened to John Grant. They said that he vomited on himself and that he convulsed more than 24 times. And even though that happened to him, the DOC just moments ago had a press conference trying to convince us that everything was fine and that it wasn't done in a way that was inhumane, which is outrageous. But I have a lot other things to say about it, but I'll want to make sure that I give you, Andy, and Scott space to comment on it as well.
Well, and I'll say, I think like a lot of folks, yesterday, Sean Murphy from the AP, also friend of the podcast, he's been on a couple of times. He was one of the members of the press. The AP has like a standing spot to observe executions. And afterwards, he came out, as you said, and shared his experience. And if you haven't seen the video on social media, listeners, I guess I'll say I encourage you to watch it. It's not easy. I mean, Sean is a tremendous reporter. He does an excellent job of conveying the facts. But honestly, I sat right here at my desk and wept. It was very weird to watch this, to think about how we treat our fellow man, and then to look, at another screen. I had my daughter on the baby monitor. She was napping, and to have these two screens in front of me where I'm on one screen watching life in the future, and the other screen I'm watching um, the end of someone's life, who was someone's child, who was, uh, and there's a lot to be said about humanity, about society, um, and I'm with you. I think I I've I think I used to be pro death penalty when I was younger, right? It made sense. It was like an eye for an eye, or like you kill someone, you should die too, and we'll nip it in the bud. That is not how it works. The data does not bear that out. The death penalty, where it exists, is not a deterrent to violent crime or any kind of crime. Um,
Nor does it bring healing or solace for
yeah,
victims and their families.
yeah. I mean, I'd say it might, right? Like, and I said this to Scott yesterday. If it was my wife, my child, my loved one who was murdered or raped or whatever the crime was, I might want that person to die. Sure, because I, as a human, am a broken person, right? And it is a natural response to want revenge, but that is exactly why we have juries, why we don't ask the victim or their families, what do you think should happen here, because it may not be the best thing. And also, we as a society can set a better standard, right? Like, we don't have to do that. So I will say one last thing, and then, Scott, I want to hear your thoughts. But the US has the sixth highest number of executions in the world, right? China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, and then the US. That's the rankings for the number of executions per year from 2019. That's not a list we want to be top 10 in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There are some folks, there are some folks from Department of Corrections and others that have felt that really what they should do in this moment is talk about Mr. Grant's crimes, why he was in prison, talk about, what the last few days were like for him. I don't think there's really any utility in doing that. Um, I will say that for me, like Andy, I had tears in my eyes yesterday, and for me, it came from reading a statement by Sarah Jernigan, who is or was Mr. Grant's attorney, and I'm just gonna read it because I think it's better than like what I could say. It says John Grant took full responsibility for the murder of Gay Carter, and he spent his years on death row trying to understand and atone for his actions more than any other client I've worked with. However, we must not forget Oklahoma's hand in this tragic story. When John stole to feed and clothe himself and his siblings, Oklahoma labeled him a delinquent instead of a desperate and traumatized child who was left to fend for himself. John wasn't even a teenager yet when Oklahoma sent him to the first of several state run youth detention facilities. Oklahoma shame would later be the label affixed to the horrors that occurred inside the walls of those facilities during John's time there, after national investigations uncovered years of institutional abuse. John's trauma from these facilities was so deep that he was simply unable to speak about it. What we learned of the myriad abuses he endured comes from others. Oklahoma ultimately dumped John on the street with no skills and no support for the mental illness that was exacerbated by years of being both the victim of and witness to beatings, rapes, and extended periods in solitary confinement, amongst other abuses. When he committed a robbery at age 17, Oklahoma sent him to an adult prison, subjecting him to further victimization, as later documented in a class action lawsuit. Through all of this, John never received the mental health care he needed or deserved while in prison. And when he eventually committed a violent crime, the murder of a prison worker, Oklahoma provided him with incompetent lawyers who had no business handling a case with the ultimate punishment at stake. I pray that John Grant is at peace now, and I pray that his death brings peace and closure to Miss Carter's family. You know, and I think that that's, I mean, to me, that like says it better than anything. Um, this was, I mean, I don't know the details of what, what all his mental health was or whatever. I don't know the details of his life other than what I just read you. Um, but I mean, I'll tell you who, all of us, I think, deserve to hear that and read about it and think about it. But our leaders are the ones that really need to take that to heart, because when we cut funding for mental health, when we cut funding for education, when we cut funding for food stamps, when we cut funding for healthcare, when we cut, we cut, and we do this over and over and over and again in the name of the economy, or in the name of lowering taxes, or in the name of not having government dependency, or the name of whatever other bullshit we do it in, this is what happens, right? Like, this was a man who was born to a single mom who had 9 kids, who grew up in abject poverty and was literally stealing as a child to provide food for his family. Like, there's no excuse for that. Like, none. There's none. That shouldn't happen in our society. We have too much. We have too much for that to happen. And and nothing that happened to Mr. Grant in his life makes the murder of gay Carter okay. It doesn't make it acceptable. It doesn't make it something for which he shouldn't be punished, and punished severely, for committing the ultimate crime. But it is wrong for us to ignore the role that our system had in his life taking the path that it did.
I'd be remiss if I didn't lift the racism that's embedded into this country and the way that we apply punishment, right? To bring it back full circle and connect the dots, we just commemorated the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. I'll never forget, because this past weekend I visited Greenwood Rising, and we saw that picture that's been used across the country to illustrate the torture and destruction that has happened in Black communities for a long time. And it's a picture of a boy and his mother hanged from a bridge. And above the 2 Black folks hanged are a group of white folks in Okemah. And their kids there, mom holding a baby, just a wide range of folks. Standing up there were probably police officers, National Guardsmen, right? Probably mailmen, church members, right? When we look at what happened May 31st and June 1st of 1921, right? Hundreds of folks died at the hands of their neighbors. And what happened? They went back home. They went back to their regular lives, right? No one was held accountable individually for dragging Black bodies across the ground, right? Burning their property to the ground and not helping them recover. Our government actively participated in killing and lynching Black bodies over time. And individual people were not held accountable. The woman who contributed to the reason why Emmett Till was mutilated, is still among us and never had been prosecuted. She lied on that young teenager, right? The men who killed him were initially freed. They weren't brought to justice, right? There's been so many cases of Black people being tortured and harmed with no accountability at all. And so in this country, we have inequitable ways that we prescribe, I guess, punishment, right? There's constantly reasons of why we justify the torturing of Black and brown bodies. When you go to South Carolina, and Dylan Wolf, I think was his name, shot an entire church of Black folks just praying, worshiping God. And the police officer took him to go get a burger. And he's sitting in somebody's prison today, right? And so the ways that we apply the law are not equitable, they're racist, and they continue today. We saw that with John Grant. We heard that with what Scott just said about the failures of this country on his life. And now we see our government actively defending their behaviors and how he suffered in his time of death. When we talk about the Oklahoma standard, that's quintessential. That's quintessential American values of how we treat black and brown folks in this country. And it's sad and it has to change.
The population of Oklahoma is just under 8% Black African American, 7 point something percent. And contrast that with the percentage of people who have been executed in Oklahoma. It's 32% are Black, right? So African Americans are way overrepresented among people who are executed. That does not mean, right, that Black people commit more heinous crimes proportionally, right? Like that means that they are put to death, they are sentenced to death at a rate way higher than their representation in the public, and that's since 1990. I'm sure if we go back before that,
It'd be a lot worse.
right.
And like I said, if we go back over time, right, some people's grandmas and great grandpas, right, should have been locked up in somebody's prison, should have been quote unquote executed if you believe that the punishment for murdering people is execution, right? But they have the ability to live in their communities without any accountability, right? They could become elected leaders. They could become public servants. They could become business owners and do all these other things, right? And I think that's something we have to reckon with, right? This is not about the past. This is stuff from the past that still remains with us today and how our systems operate to disproportionately harm Black folks in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As we move towards the end of the episode, we don't move far on topics, right? So Julius Jones, who is still on death row, who in the last week had a stay that was then lifted. He's awaiting his clemency hearing, which has been postponed to next week, to November 1st, right? And I think there are enormous questions about what the future of his life looks like.
Because Andy, and I'll live right here. This country also has a history of executing people who are innocent. That when DNA evidence came back decades later or whatever, it's oops, they really didn't do it. And it's too late. You can't bring people back from the dead after you kill them. And that's been the story of way too many Black folks who have been executed and were innocent because there has been racism in systems, right? Things of people having things planted against them to make it seem like they committed a certain crime, right? Even though it was somebody else. There's been cover-ups. That's been things that have been part of American practices and systems for decades and years and years and years, right? And so there's questions about this particular case, right? And even the Pardon and Parole Board recommended clemency. And so it's so important that we're pushing out how people feel about the death penalty, any biases that they hold. I take issue with the poll that Pat McFerrin's firm released. Coincidentally, while the governor's having to make a decision and taking the facts of this clemency hearing that's supposed to happen on November 1st, sharing that Oklahoma voters, quote unquote, and a majority of conservatives support executing folks, right? And that there's a significant part of Democrats who support executing folks in this state, and how people support executing Julie Jones. None of that matters. Public opinion shouldn't matter, right?
Right. It don't make it right.
It don't make it right at all. It's really about listening to the facts of this case, right? And making sure that he gets a fair trial and fair process throughout, right? Because this is life and death. It's that serious. And you can't go back and say, oops, my bad. And this country is guilty of that. The state is guilty of that.
In fact, I mentioned this to someone yesterday. John Grisham, the I think well-known author, right, of The Firm and all these legal books, his only nonfiction book as of 2020 is called "The Innocent Man: Murder and Injustice in a Small Town"
in Oklahoma,
about a man in Ada, right? Ron Williamson in Ada, former minor league baseball player, was wrongly convicted in 1988 of the rape and murder of a woman, sentenced to death, served 11 years on death row, and was exonerated by DNA evidence and other material that was introduced by the Innocence Project. So in 1999, he was released. It's a powerful book. I read it, probably 8-9 years ago. And then it was on Netflix. They had a special about it December of 2018 called The Innocent Man. So you can find it on there. Yeah, I mean, that wasn't that long ago, right? Like he that's in our lifetime that they convicted him and overturned it because it was wrong. And if you read, even if you go to Wikipedia and look up The Innocent Man, John Grisham, you can read the synopsis, right, of the story. And spoiler alert, the guy's innocent, right, and was exonerated. And it's just a terrible story. And I the as I don't know, as a human being, like the I can't in good conscience subject anyone to death, right? Much less someone who may not be guilty of what he was accused of. And so
There's been plenty of times in our history where Black men have been falsely accused of all kinds of stuff, right? And it's led to Black men being tortured, right?
oh man, the whatever the protocol is for someone like in the last 25 days or something before they're before they're executed is terrible. Like it is
it's horrifying.
we basically tortured them for a month before we killed them,
35 days.
which
It
is not
starts
okay.
35 days before their execution. They move them to death row, and every few days they move. I think it's every week they move to one cell closer to the execution chamber. They hear and see people that are being executed. They're not allowed visitors. I mean, it's horrifying.
And like why? Like there none of that that is only set up to torture that individual. It's not helpful in any way. There's no reason to move them closer to the chamber. Jiminy Christmas. That's
And not every state has
A death watch,
a
which
death
is what
watch,
it's called.
Yeah.
or even all states don't execute people,
No.
right? And so I just hope that our country gets to a place where we have a system that's equitable in its treatment of the law, right? That 100%. So anyway,
As I said on Twitter, the death penalty is morally reprehensible. It is fiscally irresponsible, and it doesn't change anything. Right? It's not the right thing to do. It costs us more money, and it's doesn't make anything better. Doesn't fix anything. So, all right. Well, on that note, we should wrap up. Bailey, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Andy.
Scott, thanks, man.
Wouldn't miss it.
Listeners, if you are also upset by the events of this week, the last couple of weeks, please do something. Write an email to Governor Stitt. Write a letter an email to your state representatives. Call them on the phone. Do both those things. It takes you 5 minutes, right? The least you could do is to send an email. And if you were sitting there thinking, yeah, I could, but it's not going to make a difference, at least you tried, right? Do you vote? Listen to this podcast. Surely you vote. The least you could do is send an email.
The biggest changes that have happened in this country started with the people.
That's right.
And if we don't make the change, then the change won't happen.
That's right. Go online. There are plenty of events coming up that are vigils and protests and marches and whatever for this. Even if you don't yourself know or care if Julius Jones is guilty or not, but you are opposed to the death penalty, or you at least think, we should pause on something. It's not too late. Show up, right? Do it. As we say at the end of almost every episode, decisions are made by those who show up. And man, the decision to save someone's life is a hell of a reason to show up. Have a good week.